I'm Deborah Duncombe. I'm chairman of the Book Review Committee, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all today. I really want to thank all our donors to this book review, our supporters and our underwriters, because all the funds that we raise go to the subsidy program, which is a real commitment by Holly Hall and its board. It's supported by some local churches, some great community donors, and people like you who really help for financial assistance to some of our residents who may find a need for some help in order to be able to stay at Holly Hall. And so these funds will allow them to stay at Holly Hall and continue the good life that they have here, full of respect and love. Thank you.
A very good morning to all of you out there in old Zoom land. I'm Charlotte Etchen, a very great fan of Holly Hall, and I've been the announcer for the book reviews now for several years. We sure have had a lot of fun this year coming into your living rooms, your kitchens, your dining rooms, well, other rooms in the house too, but I won't go into that. But that aside, please forgive me today. I'm going to look at my notes more because I have just met our lovely reviewer and I don't want to get anything wrong. So today, we want to welcome Ann Weisgarber, a local, and I understand Ann is from Galveston. Well, Galveston's a bedroom community to Houston, so that's local, right? Okay. Ann not only is a delightful person, she's the author of 3 historical novels. Born and raised in Ohio, and I do have grandchildren in Ohio, so I love that state too. She graduated from Wright State University in Dayton with a bachelor's degree in social work, and she earned her master's right here at our good old U of H. She's done social work in psychiatric and nursing home facilities and taught sociology at Wharton Junior College. So for someone so young, she sure has been a busy lady. She's even been inducted into Texas Institute of Letters. Now professionally, Ann belongs to the Historical Novel Society, the Houston Writers Guild, the Texas Institute of Letters, the Writers League of Texas, the Western Writers of America, and Women Writing the West. So, wow, what a resume for someone so young and with just 3 books to her. Can't wait to hear about them. Now, Ann has lived in Massachusetts, Iowa, Ohio, and Texas. She and her husband are great fans of our national parks, and they try to visit at least one a year. I hope she's been able to do that with this COVID still going on. Now, on a lighter side, Ann loves baseball, and she likes to keep score, I understand. Today, Ann's going to review for us her 3rd book, The Glovemaker. The first book now, The Personal History of Rachel Dupree, was set in the Badlands of South Dakota in 1917. If you've never seen the Badlands, you need to take a trip. Your mouth will fall open. They're amazing. Now, this book was nominated and won awards for fiction in England and the United States. Ann's second novel, The Promise, takes place in Galveston in the 1900s. And we know what happened in that time. It was America's worst natural disaster. So it too, of course, was nominated and a finalist for awards here in the United States. The Glovemaker was released just 2 years ago in February in Britain, in the United States, in Germany, and several months later in Italy. So it is worldwide. Set in Utah's backlands, now that's the deep canyon country during the winter of 1888. Boy, that makes me shiver to even think of it. Whew. It's also up for awards as well, of course. One would have to really be a historian, and I think Ann is one, to be so accurate in her details. So we're privileged today to have Ann as our reviewer. I know you will enjoy her greatly, as well as the stories she has to tell. Please welcome Ann Weisgarber.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. And my goodness, Charlotte, what a wonderful introduction. I especially love the part about your remarks about my being so young and achieving so much. So thank you many times over. I need to extend my thanks also to Susan Tran for inviting me to be here, and to Deborah Duncan, who is also part of this team, who invited me to be here at Holly Hall. I am thrilled to be here. And Hakeem, you can't see him, he's behind the camera. He is the technology guru. Fortunately, thank you for managing all this today and for making us look so professional. I really appreciate it. And I have to say it's an additional thrill to be here because this is such a good cause for Holly Hall. So I hope everybody can do their part, chip in, because as soon as I walked in the door, I felt the love in Holly Hall. And even though everybody has masks on, I could see the smiles. This is a wonderful place. So I am the author of The Glovemaker. This is my third novel. And I'm a late bloomer to writing because I didn't get started until I was in my early 40s. And I want to emphasize early 40s to keep with Charlotte's theme here. And, you know, I wrote the first book. And when I wrote it, I said, that's it. I'm not doing any more books because it's really hard work. I mean, you just have to pull it all out of your noggin. And sometimes the old noggin just doesn't feel up to it. But so much for plans, because I went on and wrote a second book, as Charlotte had mentioned, The Promise about Galveston, and then I wrote The Glovemaker, which takes place in Utah. So I often get asked, you know, how did I come to write this novel, The Glovemaker, that is set in Utah, because, you know, here I am in Texas, and the story takes place in 1888, and this is the 21st century, and it takes place in Utah's isolated canyon country. And I live in Galveston, 200 yards from the Gulf of Mexico. So how did this all happen? Well, it all started with a vacation that my husband and I took to Capitol Reef National Park in Utah. And do we have that up on the screen? Okay, that can be seen, okay. My husband and I don't know if you can see the map very well. Capitol Reef is in the southern part of the state. It's in one of the, I wish I should have brought like a little marker or something so that you could see. But there's the state of Utah, and it's in an isolated part of the state. So my husband and I are big hikers, and we had hiked about an 8-mile trail through a dry wash. And after we finished our hike, and I was not thinking about writing a book. You know, I had written the first book, I'd written the second book, and didn't think I could do more. But we did this hike, and we were bushed at the end of the hike, and so we went back to where there are orchards in the national park. And it's wonderful because the Park Service provides ladders and buckets if you happen to be there during harvest season. So my husband and I climbed up, and we picked a couple apples, and we were gnawing away on our apples, relaxing after this 8-mile hike. And I started wondering, who were the first people who planted the orchards? And, you know, I was just curious. And so I did what every curious person does. They go to the visitor center. And maybe we can switch to the picture of the visitor center. Yes, thank you. Now that is a snow scene, and I have seen it look like that before. So I went into the visitor center and I bought several books about the original homesteaders who came to Capitol Reef. And it seems that there were 2 brothers, and they had been on a cattle drive. And they had started out in Salt Lake, and they were driving cattle down to an area called the Fish Lake Mountains. And when they finished with the cattle drive, they delivered the cattle, and they decided that they were going to look around in southern Utah. So they roamed around, and they ended up in this area called the Wastelands. And it's barren, and there's just these huge rock formations. I think you can see the different pictures of these massive rocks. And one of the brothers stayed, and the other brother went back to the Salt Lake area. And then over the course of a year, several more families began to trickle into this area. And it's really just hard. I mean, I just kept looking at these massive rocks and thinking, what would possess these people to be there? So I started digging a little deeper, doing some research, and I found that of these 8 families, there was one woman who owned 20 acres. and she owned that land in her own name. And I thought, this is really unusual for the 1880s, for a woman to own land in her own name, unless she had great wealth or whether she had inherited the land. So, you know, I started digging, and I could find a lot about her up until the time she came to this little community. And oh, by the way, they had named this little area Junction, because it's where the Sulphur Creek and the Fremont River come together. And it's in the middle of the wastelands, but then all of a sudden there's this creek and this river. It's just magical. So I couldn't find much about her, so I thought, okay, I'm gonna dig in and see what I can find about her husband. And I could find when he was born, and I could find him in the 1880 census. But then I went to the 1890 census, and sadly, all the records in Washington, D.C. from the census had been in a wooden building, and it had burned down. So none of us can find anything about our ancestors in the 1890 census. So I went to the 1900 census. I could find her, but no signs of him. I went to the 1910. She's still alive. He's not in the census anywhere in the country. I went to the 1930 records. She had died by then. No signs of him. So I thought, oh, he's disappeared. And then I started looking at my very favorite website of all time. And some of you probably know it. It's www.findagrave.com. And if you have not spent any time on findagrave.com, you have not lived the good life. Because you can find all your ancestors, and people have just traveled around the United States and they take pictures of graves. And so you can type in somebody's name and hopefully they'll pop up. Well, I found her gravesite, but nothing for him. So I started thinking, this woman has 20 acres. She lives in this very isolated part of Utah, and her husband has disappeared. So I'm doing more research. And I don't know, do we have the picture of the family up? Yes, thank you. Now, this family is not in the book, but this was one of the few photographs I could find of people who lived in this little town of Junction in the 1880s. And the two older people are the parents. They're not the grandparents to any of those children, because I've seen the census records and all those children are theirs. And now we've got the picture of the schoolhouse up. Now the Park Service maintains this schoolhouse. And again, you can see the dramatic background with the rocks. But, you know, so I'm looking at the schoolhouse and you can go visit it. And as I'm doing more research, I discovered that these 8 families were all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And you might know it as the Mormon Church, or contemporary people call it LDS, which stands for Latter-day Saints. So this is no surprise. I mean, this is Utah, so this is not a surprise. But I started looking at this little community of Junction because the Park Service has still maintained the original sites of the orchards and of many of their little tiny cabins. And one thing that really stood out for me was that this little town of Junction did not have a ward house. And almost every LDS or Mormon community has ward houses. And this was one of the first buildings that the people would build when they'd come to establish a small town. And this was where they would have their community meetings. They would discuss needs of the community. They had dances there. The Mormons loved music. They loved to dance. So they held dances in their ward houses. It's where the ladies would gather to quilt. But this little town of Junction didn't have a ward house. That surprised me. Then I started reading about how Brigham Young had mandated, or strongly encouraged, people to build their houses close together, especially in these small rural communities. And so people in the church would build like 4 houses clumped together. So you'd always have a neighbor. And you know, the whole idea was you're isolated, but you have neighbors, and maybe you're kind of watching each other at the same time, who knows. But in this little town of Junction, they were spread out. Some houses were 2 to 3 miles away from the next house. So I'm like, these people say they're Mormons, but they don't have a ward house and they're not following what Brigham Young has asked them to do. And last, but certainly not least, this little town never had a bishop, and all Mormon communities had bishops. This one did not. So I started thinking, they're Mormons, and yet they're not Mormons. So then I started doing more research. Now, I'm still not going to write a book. I have sworn off the whole idea of writing the next book. So I'm just doing this for the pure fun of doing it. Meanwhile, my husband's like, oh, great, I know where this is going to go. And so then I found out that during the 1880s, the federal government had really cracked down on men who had more than one wife. In the church, they called that plural marriage. The federal government said, oh no, this is polygamy and it is a felon and we are going to get rid of it. And President Cleveland, this was his mission, to get rid of polygamy. So he sent all these federal marshals to Utah Territory, it was not a state yet, to round up these men. And these men would sometimes catch wind that they were going to be arrested, and they'd have maybe a day or two notice because news traveled fast, even without social media, and they would head for the canyon country to try to hide out. And the reason they would try to hide out is if they were caught, they would be tried, but it was not a jury of their peers because the government had said that if you were an active church member, you could not serve on a jury. So almost all these men would be convicted, imprisoned for up to 5 years, and made to pay steep fines. So these men would hide because they had families they were trying to support and they didn't want to be arrested. And many of them went to this part of Utah to hide out. And more specifically, they went to this place called Floral Ranch on Pleasant Creek. And we have a picture up of Pleasant Creek. Now, that's a very dramatic picture with the sky, but you can look at the rocks and the butte there, and it's just massive. And once these men would get to Floral Ranch, they would be safe because the marshals could never track them there. So I started thinking, how did they get to Floral Ranch? They had to go through Junction to get to Floral Ranch. And I began to put it together that they would have to have a guide to get them to Floral Ranch. So now I'm starting thinking, we've got this woman whose husband has disappeared. We've got men who are felons who show up at the doorstep asking for help. And that's at great peril for helping these men because they're felons. And if you're found aiding and abetting a felon, you're in hot water too. So I started thinking, and this whole harsh terrain where people just disappear. I thought, oh, I think I have a story. I think I have a story. But I wasn't going to write a book. But I think I might have a story. So, I'm kind of sneaking around and I'm starting to write my ideas about this. Because really, I basically have a sentence. There once was this woman who lived in this isolated area and her husband's disappeared. Meanwhile, felons are showing up and they need a guide. That's all I have. And so I could get started. Now, when you write fiction, the key is you have to have tension, tension, tension. And you always need tension on the very first page. And you have to have tension that sustains it. So I thought, I'm going to set this book in the winter time. I'm going to because winter in Utah is harsh. I actually think winter in Galveston can be kind of harsh when it hits 50 degrees. I'm feeling sorry for myself. But Utah is rough in the wintertime. So I decided this is going to take place in January. So I'm writing this book a little bit. I'm not calling it a book, just messing around. But then I started thinking, I don't know if I'm the right person to write this story because I'm not a Mormon. And all of a sudden I'm going to be stepping out into somebody else's religion. And I'm not from Utah, so what do I know? And I don't understand the canyon country and what it takes to live there, so what do I know? And I have no business writing this book at all. Not that it was a book, but I have no business writing this story. So I decided I need to go back to Utah. Well, by this time, my husband has accepted the idea that I'm writing a book, whether I'm saying that I am or not. So we decide we'll go back to Utah, and I'll do some research. But more than that, I needed to get like a sign that it was okay for me to write this book, even though I'm not a Mormon. So the book's set in January. Couldn't get there in January, so we went the first week in February, and we flew to Salt Lake. And of course, I'm wanting to see snow. I want this because I'm thinking about this whole thing about these men are trying to evade arrest, and if you're walking in the snow, you leave tracks, everybody can see where you've been, people can see where you're going. So I want to see it with snow. So we fly into Salt Lake. Well, it's the first week of February, and wouldn't you know it, we hit when they were having a hot spell. It was 70 degrees, no snow in sight at all. In fact, we went to a historical site outside of Salt Lake and we got sunburned. So I was like, okay, I'm looking for a sign that it's okay, I can write this book, and this is not happening. So we drive down to Capitol Reef, and it's a little colder. Capitol Reef is more elevated than Salt Lake, and it's in the 50s. It's still not snowing, but you know, I'm beginning to lose heart. So maybe we can switch to the picture that says Cohab Trail. Up, you need to go back up. Next one might keep, and now you need to go down. This is high technology. I'm one more, I think it's gonna be, yeah, there we go, that's it. Excellent. Now, we've already kind of skimmed past that picture, and but here it is again. Now, this is a trail that my husband and I hiked. Now, it looks a lot scarier in this picture than it really is in real life, but it's called Cohab Trail, and it's alleged that that is short for cohabitation. And it is alleged that this is where, when the men who were being chased would come to Junction and ask for help and to get to Floral Ranch, which Floral Ranch is another 8 miles, that the men would be taken up. Now, can we go back to Cohab? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very good. The men would be taken up on this trail, because when you go up on the trail, you go over the top of this butte, and on the backside, nature has carved out these little shallow caves. And it's thought that the men would stay, maybe spend the night in a shallow cave before they could be taken on to Floral Ranch. And so, and also when you stand down in the orchards and you look at the trail, you look at the side of this cliff, or it's not a cliff, but the side of this butte, you can't see the trail. It does not show from the ground. You have to have the sign to show you where the trailhead is. So it's impossible. So I'm thinking, when the marshals would come through looking for these men, this was a safe trail for them to go up and hide on, because it's not visible from the ground. So my husband and I hiked that and take a few pictures. Still no snow, no snow. Okay, so then I went to the park ranger station, and I told the park ranger, I said, you know, I'm hearing about this place called Floral Ranch, but I can't find it on the park maps. And I've got the geographical map, I've got as detailed as it can be. And I said, do you know where this Floral Ranch was? He said, oh, sure. You know, all you do, you drive to the end of the park road where it dead ends. And then he said, you're gonna hike another 3 miles. But when you get to the end of the park road, there's the little cairns. And if you're a hiker, you know what cairns are. They're just little piles of rocks. Well, let me tell you, there's nothing but piles of rocks in this area, but you have to really know what you're looking for. So there's little piles of rocks that mark the trail. And he said, just follow it for 3 miles and you'll come to these outbuildings. And they still exist. They still stand from the days of Floral Ranch and when the men hid out there. So now maybe we can look at the Floral Ranch. Yeah, there it is. So we hiked, no snow, but there's Floral Ranch. And it just gave me chills to be there, because I was thinking about, this was sanctuary for these men who were trying to evade arrest for religious reasons, whether you agreed with it or not. This was their purpose. So we spent a little bit of time at Floral Ranch, took pictures, and then we left Floral Ranch, hiked back 3 miles, and then got in our car. And I went back to where the orchards are. And in the orchards, there's a bridge. Now maybe we can click to that picture, the next one. Excellent. Well done. And there's this footbridge. And that was where there had originally been like a little, very rustic bridge. The Park Service now it's a modern footbridge, so it's not going to collapse on you. So you can't really tell, but it's over Sulphur Creek. And there's a little slight dusting of snow, ever so slight, just not enough. But there's an orchard on one side and an orchard on the other side, which actually one side became my Deborah character's orchard, and the other side became my Nels character's, his orchard. But I stood in the middle of that bridge for a long time, and I stood there thinking about how these people were in between. They claimed they were Mormons, and yet they didn't really practice their faith like might be expected. They didn't practice polygamy. Of the 8 families, there was one man that had 2 wives. The rest of them didn't. So most of them did not approve of polygamy, and yet when these men who were polygamists came, they helped them. And I just stood in the middle of the bridge. And bridges are very symbolic in the literary world. And once you cross the bridge, there's no going back. And then I'm hearing this, Simon and Garfunkel's song, "A Bridge Over Troubled Waters," and I'm thinking this is troubled land. But I'm still needing snow. I'm still needing a sign that it's okay for me to write this book. So then, because I had findagrave.com, I knew where my Deborah character was buried. And I have to say here that I've imagined much of her life, although I know quite a bit about her early years. What happens in Junction, I have imagined based on little bits and pieces. So I don't want you to think that this is exactly what happened to the real historical person. It's not, I don't know. But I visited her grave, and maybe we can click to that next. Excellent. And I didn't take a close-up of her picture because of her grave, because I've changed her name. I want her to have her privacy. But her stone really got to me because it has her name on it, and then it says daughter of, and it has her parents' name. It does have her birth date and her death date, but it has daughter of, and it does not say wife of. And in the 1880s, most women, that was their identity. They were wife of. And yet, when I looked at all the census records for her, and I looked at her death certificate, it's got the M for married, not a W for widowed, and certainly not a D for divorced. Oh, good Lord. And not in the 1880s. But so she considered herself married, even though her husband had disappeared for decades. And the other thing that really got me about her, because I looked at the other tombstones around her, and you can see she's very alone there, but she had been completely alone. There was nobody in that entire section of the cemetery the first 9 years that she was buried there. And I asked a historian in Utah what she thought that meant, and this historian is LDS or Mormon, and she said, oh, it meant she was probably a bad girl. And I'm thinking all kinds of, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. And I said, what do you mean a bad girl? And she said she probably wasn't a strict observer of church policies. And I said, oh, that all fits. But it really got me when I saw her gravesite, and I thought, I think I need to write this book to remember people like her who are so alone in the world. And that afternoon, we went back to our little motel, and trust me, in this area, there are no hotels. Everything is a motel. And we went back to our little motel, and it's February. We're about the only other people staying there are like construction workers. And that afternoon, it began to snow, and it began to snow. And we jumped in the car, and we drove back through the park, and we went to where Floral Ranch was, because I had to see Floral Ranch, what it looked like when it was snowing. And the clouds are descending, so all these magnificent rocks, these stones, these buttes are disappearing. And we drive and we start to hike, and it's snowing, and it's snowing, and it's just gorgeous. But all of a sudden the cairns are, the markers have disappeared. They're getting snowed under, and it's getting darker. And I thought, we're turning around. This is getting dangerous. We could get lost out here. Nobody knows we're here other than our car is parked here. And I thought, that's gonna happen in the book. They're gonna get lost in the snow, and they have to turn back, and everything goes wrong from that point. And then we went back, got in the car, went back where we were on safe ground, and we can go to the last picture. And I went to the orchard, which I envisioned were the orchards of my Deborah character. And there, the snow is sticking to the trees. And you can see like a little tunnel there, and that is the irrigation ditch that was dug by the original homesteaders, which the Park Service today still continues to keep digging them out. And I walked through the orchards, and I said, "This is my sign. I'm going to write this book." And so that is how it all got started.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. I think sometimes your story about writing this book and your curiosity would be a marvelous book too. I really enjoyed hearing
Well,
that.
thank you, Deborah. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about all the characters in the book, and of course my favorite was Deborah. But I thought one of the main characters was Utah. Were the bluffs and the trails and the water. So I loved getting to see your pictures of the area. It really made it come to life for me. So I thank you.
Thank you. You know, you can't be there and not feel how the scenery, the landscape would shape people's behavior, because it certainly shaped my behavior. And and it's so isolated. It's kind of scary, and you feel very small in this big landscape, and it's also very isolated. So you know, you learn to depend on yourself, and but just the loneliness of the location. But what truly, how people survived, I don't know how they did it.
I don't know how they did it. I think loneliness is a real dilemma for people.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me to find that this city decided to almost isolate themselves too. They moved away from any city or township and then moved away from each other. Very curious.
It is very curious, and other than, the only thing that I could figure was that these people felt a little smothered by the church. And these were people that were just kind of loners. And I think we all know loners. They're, you know, we call them hermits. And these people thrived on being independent and being alone. And so, yeah, it all kind of comes together. And I think that was the value of going back and actually walking and marking off and walking in the orchards and walking how far was it from one home to the next home. Not in the car, but walking it.
Really? Well, we say, or it has been said, that we don't really know another's journey till we walk in their footsteps.
Right.
So that's a beautiful, so I'm thinking about you also walking through the Badlands of South Dakota. And I did read on one website where you might have an interest in a book about Central Texas and a German POW camp. Would that be Mahia?
No, actually it was Hearne, Texas.
Hearne. Okay.
Which most people know Hearne as a place where if you're driving too fast, you get stopped by the police.
Totally.
It's a speed trap. But it had been a town that had about 4,000 German POWs during World War II.
Okay.
And I did start on that project, and I couldn't get the story to mesh.
Okay.
So I've set it aside for now.
Okay.
And I'm not working on that now, but it's interesting history though. Again, thinking about this whole idea of this small town of Hearne, and all of a sudden there's 4,000 German POWs in their midst. Yeah, fascinating. So someday I'll get back to it.
Well, that's right. I know of the POW camp in Mahia, so maybe there's a story of this whole Central Texas being invaded by German officers. I don't know.
Yeah.
Check in later. All right. So I was also curious in doing research about this book. That's the cover I loved of her walking with the lantern and seeing 2 steps ahead of herself in this wilderness. But on the website, there are 2 other covers. Talk to us about how a cover is ever created in your book. It's your book, it's your story.
It is, and I have no input at all in the cover at all. The way it works is that the publishing house has an art department, or sometimes they have contractors who they're artists, And so the artist is given like a little synopsis of the book. Many times they don't even read the book. They just get a short synopsis and they start coming up with ideas for what they think the cover should be. And of course, then once they they have mock-ups. And then they present it to the editor and the sales team and the marketing team. Because your book becomes a product. They start calling it a product. You're like, really? A product? But okay. And,
it's my baby.
It's my book, but they're calling it a product. And it's a package that they put together. So they go back and forth with what they think sales and marketing will like. And then I usually get an email that will say, you know, dear Ann, we've been working on the cover for months, and many people have put hours and hours and hours into this, and we really hope you love this because we love it. And then you know, open the attachment, and there it is, and then you're kind of like, it's not my vision at all. And so, you know, I can have a little input. I can say, you know, maybe we can tweak this or we can tweak that, and they will tweak things. So the cover is, you know, they look at it in terms of how it will look on a bookshelf, what will draw a reader's eye to maybe purchase it. The other covers that you saw, because there's foreign editions, the UK has a different cover. Then the UK hardback is a glove, it's a hand. And that's what they chose instead. And then when they did the paperback, they did something closer to the American edition, which is the one you know. Then the Italian edition is completely different. They even changed the title for that. And then there is the German edition, which is also different. So they market it to their audience, and I have no input. And it's probably just as well that I don't know, because I would have come up with something completely different.
Yes. And be sitting still on the shelf, because it wouldn't have had all that product research behind it.
Exactly, and sometimes they actually take the mock-ups to the major bookstores and to the headquarters of someplace like Barnes & Noble, and will ask what they think about it. And if they don't like it, then it really does go back to scratch. It starts all over again.
Well, I really liked the one that was sort of 3 tones, and it had the woman in profile, but it had the red bluffs behind her, just tiny bit in the distance. And I thought that gave me a nice sense of those.
I think that's the UK edition. That's the UK edition. Yeah, I like that too.
Good.
I like that too.
Good. Okay, well, it's interesting, you know, the old phrase about don't judge a book by the cover. So rings very true here, doesn't it?
Or the other way we could put it is, don't blame the author.
Don't blame the author. Right. I visited with several friends about this because I enjoyed this book. I was glad you agreed to come talk to us. So I sent it around to several people. And the remark I kept getting when they'd respond to me was, this is about in-between. People, you know, the in-betweeners, the husband on his journey talked about that. And it's a whole story about people in between good and bad, alone and together. Can you talk about that just a bit?
Yeah, you know, what a lovely thing that people have picked up on that, because, you know, I did write this thinking of these people that are Mormons and yet they're not Mormons, and people who are helping people who are doing a practice that they don't believe in, and yet they are their own. And how do you turn your back on your own? And Samuel, who is Deborah's husband, the person who has gone missing, there's flashbacks so you can hear his voice a little bit, and he talks about liking to see where the landscape changes, where it, you know, begins to elevate a little bit, or where does it go from being barren to having more grass. And that's that in-between place. And I think, you know, we're always in between. We never fit 100% in one slot or the other. We've often have one foot in one place and one foot somewhere else. And I think that's what enriches us as people. And I think because it's such a balancing act, that adds depth to our lives and how well we cope with that. But tell your friends thank you for picking up on that. I appreciate that.
I will. I'll give them some credit for being good readers.
They are good readers.
So Pamela Hudgens, and I was going to ask you about how you feel about reviews and criticisms. Do you read them? Do you react?
I don't read Amazon reviews. I cannot read Amazon reviews. My husband will read Amazon reviews. And if there's something he thinks that I need to know, he'll tell me, but otherwise I don't know. It doesn't, there's nothing I can do in terms of changing the book, and that's often what reviews want me to do. They want me to change the ending, they want me to change something, I can't do anything about it. I do read the print reviews, but I have had my editors call me and say, you know, we want you, you know, there's a really good review, you're fine to read it. I've had my editor call and say, you know, there was a print review and there's going to be, it's a rave except for one little sentence. And so, you know, but that's the sentence that we authors pick up on. And I know people who have taken to their bed because they've had bad reviews. So I just try not to, you know, let it get into my head too much. Easier said than done, though.
Oh, I would think so. I would think it'd be very tempting.
Yeah.
To get, you know, warm fuzzies. Being a teacher, we all want warm fuzzies, so, okay. Well, Pamela Hudgens, what I started to say from USA Today, said, Anne has the gift of wringing the beautiful out of the brutal and invisible. And I think of all the reviews I read, I thought that was one of the most insightful and complimentary. You did wring a beautiful story out of this kind of harsh story.
Thank you. Thank you. I always feel guided by the characters. I feel like I'm not the one who wrote the book, it's the characters who wrote it. So you just kind of channel who I think they are, and I become their voice. So that is a lovely review.
Well, thank you so much for channeling those wonderful people. And I'd love to see the book when Nels and Deborah get married, but that's maybe another day, right?
Another book for sure.
Another book.
And I give that you to write that book.
Yeah, I know. But thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. We have a delightful review next time too. If it is anywhere near as good as this, you're not going to want to miss it. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Deborah.
Bye, y'all.
Oh, wow, Anne. I feel like I've gone back in time. Thank you for that fascinating story and that great, beautiful depiction of the place. It just makes you want to visit. I have seen some of that part of the world, and it is awesome, believe me. But now I want to tie the story into what I've seen, and I can't wait to read the book. So not only do I want to read The Glovemaker, now I want to read The Promise and The Personal History of Rachel Dupree. So they're utmost on my list. So bookstore, here I come. Watch out for me. I just love history, and I love it to be included in your fiction. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Now our next and last reviewer for the year on March 18th will be Catherine Center. I think you remember Catherine was scheduled to be with us this past year, and then of course COVID hit, so we had to postpone it. Well, she's coming back for us and going to be Zooming with us. So mark your calendars, March 18th, and more to come soon about that. Now she's going to be talking about how she became a best-selling author, and sort of goes into the insight into her work and the writing process and how she got to be where she is and life in general. And believe it or not, Catherine is hilarious. If you've never heard her before, you're really going to enjoy her. She just tells very funny tales about her life and everything about what she's done. So I know you're going to enjoy that. So be sure and join us when you hear how Catherine has ascended into this literary world of hers. She loves to tell about the lost husband, and we've all got a few stories about a lost husband, I'm sure. But hers is going to be really about a movie. Her book was turned into a wonderful movie. This past summer, supposedly, many saw it. So I'm hoping someday to get to see it. So many of us could enjoy a story like that, I'm sure. I know you're going to enjoy hearing about it. So please join us again on March 18th. We're going to Zoom with Catherine and hear all about her wonderful stories and how she got to be where she is. So thank you again for being with us today. I know you're anxious to go buy Anne's books, just like I am. It was a wonderful review. Thank you, Anne, again, for letting us be a part of your world and your literary ascent. Goodbye for now, and don't forget to get your shots. Bye-bye now.